If you're watching this video, you're likely aware that co-ops in New York City have broad discretion to approve or reject prospective purchasers. Now, oftentimes a co-op may actually reject a purchaser not for any reason pertaining to the applicant's financials, but rather because the contract price itself is deemed to be unacceptably low by the co-op board. So in this video, we're going to talk about a common method for reducing the risk of this happening in your potential transaction. I'm Nick at Hauseit. You can visit Hauseit.com to learn how to save money if you are buying, selling, or renting here in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or South Florida. So, how does one reduce the risk of being rejected by the board due to a low contract price? Well, the long and short of it is that the contract itself can be adjusted or papered to show an artificial price. For example, if the price agreed between buyer and seller is, say, $2.6 million, and you're pretty confident that the co-op won't be happy with that number, you can simply instruct the attorneys to draft the contract with a much higher price. For example, something like $3.5 million. So just to reiterate, the economics of the deal are still $2.6 million in terms of the price, but the paper itself, the contract, which is going to be submitted to the co-op board as part of the board application, will have an inflated number. Now, of course, in addition to the contract itself, the attorneys on the deal will, of course, paper something on the side, which makes it very clear that at closing, the seller will return the excess proceeds to the purchaser. Now, one ramification for this method is that it does increase the total closing costs on the transaction. Both buyer and seller closing costs are impacted by artificially increasing the contract price. It can affect the closing costs vis-a-vis the mansion tax that the buyer typically pays. It can affect the seller's closing costs through the city and state transfer tax obligations. And it can also affect either the buyer or the seller through the flip tax. So on the screen, we've actually put together an example showing the difference in closing costs associated with artificially increasing the contract price. As you can see, there is a meaningful increase in the closing cost bill as a result of changing the contract price to appease the board. Now, who's responsible for these incremental closing costs really depends on the particulars of the situation at hand. Who has the leverage? Is it the buyer who has the leverage, or is it the seller? And depending on the answer, that will dictate the flow of the conversation and ultimately who agrees to pay the incremental closing costs associated with changing the contract price. But in general, we would say the most common approach for this scenario is, of course, that the seller is responsible for the incremental city and state transfer taxes, as well as the incremental flip tax bill associated with this increase in the contract price. Ultimately, keep in mind that it's the seller who is needing to do this in order to sell their property because of the rigidity of the co-op board. So the seller, it would be unreasonable in most cases for the seller to say, you actually have to pay the additional seller closing costs associated with this financial manipulation that we're doing because of my co-op board. So again, it'll be most common for the seller to pick up the tab for the flip tax and the city and state closing costs increases associated with the higher contract price. Now, for the mansion tax, usually we would say that the seller would at least try to make the buyer pay that. But ultimately, it depends on who has the leverage as to whether or not the buyer would agree to pay this overage on the mansion tax specifically. Now, if you are in this situation and you're financing, it's very important to check with your lender to see if this type of activity is even permitted. So we hope you found this video to be helpful, short and sweet. The answer is that you can adjust the contract price higher and submit a contract to the board with the higher price being referenced. And on the side, the seller agrees to give back the additional money to the buyer, and then the buyer and seller work out who's responsible for the incremental closing costs associated with increasing the contract price to appease the board. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below this video or send an email to team@hauseit.com. And please do check out hauseit.com to learn how to save money if you are buying, selling, or renting a co-op, condo, or a townhouse in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or South Florida. I'm Nick at Hauseit, and we'll see you on the next video.